In the autumn mists of 1877, deep in the hollow-tip mountains of West Virginia, there existed a company town that the maps would soon forget. Black Ash was its name, and coal was its lifeblood. But beneath the surface of pickaxes and steam whistles, something far more sinister sustained the ruling family. Workers vanished with disturbing regularity, their disappearances explained away as desertion or cave-ins. Yet their bodies were never found, their families never notified. The Cuthbert family, owners of the Weeping Seam mine, were known for their strange generosity, occasionally distributing parcels of fine meat to the families of the missing. What no one dared to question was the source of such charity in a place where even salt was rationed. The miners whispered of sounds echoing from the deep tunnels, sounds that resembled feasting more than excavation. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. When the mine finally collapsed that October night, the official record blamed a methane explosion, but a single smuggled ledger page would later reveal the truth. The miners had orchestrated their master's burial, sealing them alive in their own underground feast hall. This was not just crime. This was perfect retribution delivered by men who had discovered their overlords were feeding on human flesh. In the grimy pages of an unsent letter, found decades later in the ruins of a company house, Maeve Jones wrote to her sister in Cardiff with trembling hands. Her husband Elijah, she explained, had begun speaking in his sleep about sounds that came from the deep mine, sounds of iron teeth and whispered gratitude. She described how the Cuthbert family would sometimes distribute cuts of meat to families whose fathers had vanished, calling it charity for the bereaved. The letter never reached Wales. Maeve Jones died that winter of what the company doctor called consumption, though neighbors noted she had stopped eating meat entirely in her final months. Her words, however, survived, hidden beneath loose floorboards with her husband's secret Bible and a page torn from a company ledger that would damn the Cuthberts forever. According to the official record published in the Black Ash Clarion on October 12, 1877, the Cuthbert family perished tragically in a sudden mine collapse caused by methane ignition. Silas Cuthbert, the patriarch, along with his sons Hiram and Absalom, were conducting a routine inspection of the Weeping Seam when disaster struck. The newspaper praised their contributions to West Virginia's industrial progress and mourned the loss of 3 generations of mining expertise. But Elijah Jones and his fellow miners knew better. They had spent weeks planning what they called their perfect retribution, a controlled cave-in that would entomb their cannibal masters in the very tunnels where they had consumed their workforce. The methane explosion was their cover story, carefully orchestrated to hide the truth of deliberate righteous murder. Sheriff Cobb's ledger, discovered years later during probate proceedings, contained a single telling entry dated October 31st, 1877. Quiet. Final payment received from the company. Matter concluded. The silence that followed would last for generations, broken only by the whispers of those few who knew what really lay buried beneath the collapsed Weeping Seam. The evidence suggests that on that autumn night, the exploited became the executioners, and the earth itself became their courtroom. The miners had discovered that their missing comrades were not victims of industrial accidents, but ingredients in a feast that had sustained the Cuthbert family for decades. The hollow-tip mountains rise from West Virginia's coal country like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, their peaks shrouded in perpetual mist that seems to swallow sound and light alike. In 1877, these mountains held secrets that mapmakers would deliberately omit, places where company towns existed solely to feed the appetites of their industrial masters. Black Ash occupied a narrow valley between 2 ridges, accessible only by a single winding road. that turned to mud with every rain. The settlement was laid out according to the iron logic of company hierarchy. The Cuthbert Manor perched on the eastern hill, like a Gothic crown, its windows overlooking every shack and shanty below. The company store sat at the valley's heart, its false front painted bright red to hide the rotting timber beneath. Below the store, arranged in neat rows like cemetery plots, stood the miners' quarters. These structures barely deserved the name of houses, being little more than tar paper walls and tin roofs that leaked with every storm. Families of 8 or 10 crowded into spaces meant for half that number. Their lives measured not in years, but in shifts worked and debts accumulated at the company store. The mine entrance itself yawned from the mountainside like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. The locals called it the Weeping Seam, though none could explain the name's origin. Some said it wept groundwater that tasted of iron and salt. Others claimed the name came from the sound the wind made when it passed through the deeper tunnels, a low moaning that seemed almost human in its desperation. The mine cage, a rickety elevator that carried men into the earth's bowels, operated with the grinding regularity of a metronome. Its cables sang with tension as it descended into shafts that had been carved deeper than any geological survey recommended. The deepest levels, where the newest and most desperate workers were assigned, had been excavated beyond any practical coal vein, as if the Cuthberts were digging not for mineral wealth, but for something else entirely. Maps from the United States Geological Survey, drawn 3 years after the collapse, mark the Black Ash Mine as played out and collapsed, with a handwritten notation in the margin: unstable strata, unexplained, localized seismic event recorded autumn 77. What the maps do not show are the tunnels that extended beyond the official mine boundaries, chambers that served purposes far removed from coal extraction. Silas Cuthbert commanded his industrial empire with the cold efficiency of a man who had reduced human life to a matter of profitable calculation. At 63, he possessed a vitality that seemed to mock the gray pallor of his workers. His cheeks ruddy with health, while theirs grew hollow from constant exposure to coal dust and malnutrition. His black hair showed no gray, his teeth remained white and strong, and his hands bore none of the scars that marked every other man who worked the mines. His sons, Hiram and Absalom, served as extensions of their father's will, enforcing company discipline with brass knuckles and iron bars. Hiram, the elder at 38, possessed his father's calculating nature, but with a cruel smile that seemed to promise violence as readily as wages. Absalom, 5 years younger, was known for his unusual kindness to the children of the camp, often distributing sweets and small gifts that made the little ones eager to please him. The Cuthbert family had operated the Weeping Seam for over 2 decades, yet none of the miners could recall them ever aging. While their workers bent and broke under the weight of industrial labor, the Cuthberts seemed to draw strength from the mine itself, as if the earth were feeding them rather than being fed upon. Their clothes remained fine while their workers wore rags. Their table groaned under the weight of delicacies while their employees subsisted on beans and hardtack. Most mysterious of all was the figure the family referred to as the grandsire, Silas's father, who had allegedly founded the mine in the 1840s. No worker had seen him in over a decade, yet the Cuthberts spoke of him as if he were not merely alive, but actively involved in the mine's operations. Deliveries of fine wines and exotic spices arrived regularly at the manor, far more than 3 men could possibly consume, leading to whispered speculation about the grandsire's continued existence and peculiar appetites. The family's last will and testament, filed with the county courthouse but sealed until after the collapse, revealed the disturbing nature of their final arrangements. Silas's will left the mine and all its holdings to his sons, but contained a strange codicil that referenced the eternal flame in the deep dark and promised that His sustenance shall be maintained as sworn. The document suggested the existence of obligations that extended beyond mere business partnerships into something far more sinister. Their generosity to the families of missing workers had always seemed odd in a company town where every nail and grain of salt was carefully rationed. Yet when a miner vanished, the Cuthberts would invariably appear at the family's door within days, bearing parcels of meat wrapped in fine linen and preserved with expensive salt. They called it charity for the bereaved, Christian kindness in a harsh industrial world. Joe Harker made the mistake of asking too many questions about the missing men, and by autumn of 1876, he had become the next to disappear. A troublemaker in the eyes of the company, Harker had organized informal meetings where miners discussed the strange pattern of vanishings that seemed to follow no logic of accident or desertion. He noted that the missing were invariably men without local family ties, workers who would not be immediately missed by anyone with influence. The night before his disappearance, Harker was seen arguing with Hiram Cuthbert outside the company store, his voice carrying across the valley as he demanded answers about the fate of 3 Shanghaied laborers who had arrived the previous month. Witnesses heard him accuse the family of keeping false records and operating the mine with a callous disregard for human life that bordered on murder. Sheriff Cobb, a former mine captain who owed his position to Cuthbert patronage, dismissed Harker's disappearance as simple desertion. The man had debts at the company store, Cobb explained, and had probably fled in the night rather than face the consequences of his mounting obligations. Doc Albright, the company physician, signed a certificate stating that Harker had been treated for black lung and had expressed intentions to seek better air in another state. But Tom Miller, a Welsh immigrant known as Dusty for his perpetually coal-stained clothes, told a different story to those who would listen. Miller claimed he had been working a late shift in the deeper tunnels when he heard sounds coming from a section of the mine that had been walled off months earlier. The sounds, he insisted, were not the familiar noises of mining or machinery, but something far more disturbing: the rhythmic scraping of metal against bone, accompanied by what could only be described as satisfied murmuring. Miller's account grew more detailed with each telling, as if the horror of what he had witnessed was slowly crystallizing in his memory. He spoke of hearing his name called from beyond the sealed wall, spoken in Joe Harker's voice but with an odd hollow quality that made his skin crawl. When he pressed his ear to the barrier, he could hear what sounded like a feast in progress, complete with the clink of silverware and the satisfied sounds of multiple diners. The coroner's inquest into Harker's disappearance was perfunctory, lasting less than an hour and concluding that the man had likely fallen into an unmapped shaft while attempting to steal coal for personal use. No body was recovered, which the officials explained was common in mine accidents, where cave-ins could bury evidence beyond any hope of retrieval. The case was closed and Harker's name was struck from the company rolls as if he had never existed. The arrival of 12 new laborers in September of 1877 should have brought relief to the overworked miners of Black Ash, but instead it filled them with a dread they could not articulate. These men were different from the usual volunteers who came seeking work in the coal fields. They bore the telltale marks of Shanghaied men, sailors' tattoos, the pallor of long sea voyages, and the confused desperation of those who had been drugged and transported against their will. Hiram Cuthbert personally escorted the new arrivals to their quarters, a section of the deepest tunnel that had been hastily converted into sleeping space. The location struck the veteran miners as odd, since company policy had always been to house workers as close to the surface as possible to minimize the time spent traveling to and from the coalface. These men would have to descend nearly 400 feet each morning just to reach their living space. The newcomers spoke little English, but their gestures and desperate attempts at communication told a clear story of betrayal and imprisonment. They had been promised passage to America and honest work, only to find themselves trapped in a company town where their movements were monitored and their communications with the outside world were impossible. The company store refused to extend them credit, leaving them entirely dependent on whatever charity the Cuthberts chose to provide. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. Within 2 weeks, half of the Shanghaied laborers had vanished from their underground quarters. The official explanation was that they had been transferred to another Cuthbert operation in Pennsylvania, but no paperwork existed to document such transfers, and none of the men had been seen departing the valley. Their few possessions remained in the deep quarters, including personal items that no man would willingly leave behind. Elijah Jones, a Welsh immigrant who served as an unofficial lay preacher for the miners, found his Christian conscience increasingly troubled by the treatment of these desperate men. Unlike most of his fellow workers, Jones could read and write, skills he had hidden from the Cuthberts to avoid being promoted to a supervisory position that would have made him complicit in their operations. His secret literacy allowed him to keep detailed notes in the margins of his hidden Bible, documenting the pattern of disappearances that company records seemed designed to obscure. The breaking point came when Jones discovered a page torn from the company store ledger, apparently dropped by accident near the mine entrance. The page detailed regular orders for luxury items that seemed impossible in a subsistence operation. Cases of fine wine, exotic spices, silk linens, and cuts of meat that were listed not by type, but by a classification system that used terms like Shanghaied and consumed. The quantities suggested a feast that went far beyond the needs of 3 men, no matter how wealthy. Elijah Jones had spent enough years in the Weeping Seam to know every tunnel, every junction, and every supposedly sealed passage in the mine's labyrinthine network. His knowledge, combined with Tom Miller's disturbing observations, led them to undertake a covert investigation that would reveal the true purpose of the Cuthbert operation. What they discovered was not simply a coal mine, but a carefully designed system for the capture, processing, and consumption of human beings. The breakthrough came when Jones noticed discrepancies in the mine's official layout compared to what he observed during his shifts. Certain tunnels appeared on no company map, yet were clearly in regular use, as evidenced by the wear patterns on their floors and the fresh timber supports that reinforced their walls. These unmapped passages all led deeper into the mountain, extending well beyond any economically viable coal deposits. On a moonless night in late September, Jones and Miller followed Hiram and Absalom Cuthbert as they made one of their mysterious late-night journeys into the mine. The brothers carried no mining equipment, but instead pushed a cart loaded with what appeared to be supplies, bottles of wine, fine linens, and metal implements that caught the lamplight with an ominous gleam. Their destination was a section of the mine that had been officially abandoned months earlier. The 2 miners watched from concealment as the Cuthbert brothers approached what appeared to be a solid wall of coal and timber. Hiram produced a key from his vest and inserted it into a lock that had been cleverly concealed within the natural irregularities of the tunnel wall. The barrier swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing not a dead end, but a passage that descended even deeper into the earth's bowels. From their hiding place, Jones and Miller could hear sounds emerging from the hidden passage that defied rational explanation. There was the scrape of chairs being moved, the clink of metal against ceramic, and underneath it all, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the mountain itself. Most disturbing of all was the sound of a voice, deep and resonant, speaking in tones of anticipation and hunger, that seemed barely human in their intensity. The Cuthbert brothers emerged from the hidden passage nearly 2 hours later, their cart now empty and their clothes stained with substances that looked disturbingly like blood in the lamplight. They locked the concealed door carefully behind them and departed with the satisfied air of men who had completed important business. Jones noted in his Bible that night that the brothers had the look of men who had just attended a successful feast. The next morning, one of the remaining Shanghai laborers was discovered missing from his quarters in the deep tunnels. His bunk showed signs of a struggle, and his few possessions were scattered as if he had been dragged away while attempting to resist. Company records would later show that he had been transferred to another operation, but Jones and Miller now understood the true nature of such transfers. Billy Kincaid was 12 years old when curiosity killed him, though it would take the miners weeks to understand the true meaning of his disappearance. As a breaker boy, Billy spent his days sorting coal from slate in the surface buildings, his small fingers nimble enough to pick through the debris that adult hands might miss. His position gave him a unique vantage point to observe the comings and goings of the Cuthbert family, and his natural inquisitiveness made him bold enough to ask questions that wiser men had learned to avoid. The boy had been asking about the Shanghai laborers, wondering aloud why men would come so far to work in the deepest parts of the mine, only to leave without collecting their wages. His questions reached the wrong ears when he approached Absalom Cuthbert directly, asking with the innocent persistence of childhood why the new men seemed so scared and why they kept disappearing without saying goodbye to anyone. Absalom's response was characteristic of his particular brand of manipulation. Rather than anger or dismissal, he showed Billy unusual kindness, ruffling his hair and praising his observant nature. He gave the boy a sweet cake from his personal supplies, a luxury that Billy had never tasted, and promised to show him something special the next day if he would meet him near the mine entrance after the evening shift ended. Maeve Jones, whose husband Elijah had been tracking the disappearances, later recalled that Billy had been excited about his appointment with Absalom. The boy had bragged to his friends about being singled out by one of the mine owners, describing the sweet cake as the most delicious thing he had ever eaten, and speculating about what special thing he might be shown. His enthusiasm was infectious, and several other children expressed envy at Billy's apparent good fortune. Billy never returned from his meeting with Absalom Cuthbert. His absence was not discovered until the following morning, when his mother went to wake him for his shift at the breaker and found his bunk empty and cold. A search of the surface buildings revealed no trace of him, and questioning of the other children produced only accounts of his excitement about his appointment with the mine owner's son. The official investigation into Billy's disappearance was handled with the same perfunctory efficiency that had characterized all previous cases. Doc Albright examined Billy's empty bunk and pronounced that the boy had probably suffered an accident while exploring the mine's surface structures. Sheriff Cobb nodded in agreement and filed a report stating that Billy Kincaid had died by misadventure in a collapsed tunnel, though he noted that no body had been recovered for verification. The coroner's inquest lasted exactly 15 minutes and reached the predetermined conclusion that Billy had been the victim of an unfortunate accident. His death certificate was signed and filed. His name was removed from the company rolls, and his mother was informed that she would need to vacate her quarters within a week since she no longer had a family member employed by the mine. The machinery of official silence ground forward with practiced efficiency, but Elijah Jones found Billy's neckerchief 3 days later during his own covert investigation of the hidden passages. The piece of cloth was caught on a timber support near the concealed door that led to the Cuthbert family's secret chamber. It was stained with substances that Jones preferred not to examine too closely, and it carried with it the unmistakable message, that Billy Kincaid had discovered the wrong secret at the wrong time. The discovery of Billy Kincaid's neckerchief transformed Elijah Jones from a concerned observer into a man driven by righteous fury. The death of an innocent child crossed a moral boundary that even the grinding oppression of company town life could not excuse, and Jones knew that formal justice would never reach the Cuthberts through official channels. If the truth were to be revealed and retribution delivered, it would have to come from the miners themselves. Jones assembled a small group of trusted men, all of whom had lost friends or family members to the mysterious disappearances that plagued Black Ash. Tom Miller brought his intimate knowledge of the mine's deepest tunnels, while Patrick O'Brien contributed his expertise with explosives from his previous work in Pennsylvania's anthracite fields. Each man understood that their investigation would likely mean death if they were discovered, but Billy's murder had made the risk seem worthwhile. Their opportunity came during the third week of October, when the Cuthbert family traveled to Charleston for a meeting with investors interested in expanding their mining operations. With the owners absent and only Sheriff Cobb remaining to maintain order, the miners could move through the tunnels with relative freedom. They had perhaps 6 hours to penetrate the hidden chamber and discover what the Cuthberts had been concealing from their workforce. Jones led the group to the concealed door he had observed Hiram and Absalom using during their nocturnal visits. The lock proved more sophisticated than anything typically found in a mining operation, requiring nearly an hour of careful manipulation before O'Brien's lock-picking skills could defeat it. The passage beyond descended at a steep angle, following what appeared to be a natural cave system that the Cuthberts had enlarged and reinforced with timber supports. The hidden chamber they discovered defied every assumption about the nature of the mining operation. Instead of coal bins or equipment storage, they found a dining hall that would not have been out of place in the finest restaurant in Charleston. Long tables were set with silver service and fine china. Crystal glasses caught the light from ornate chandeliers, and silk tapestries covered walls that had been carved smooth from the living rock. But it was the kitchen area that revealed the true horror of the Cuthbert operation. Hanging from iron hooks were joints of meat that had been butchered with professional skill, their surfaces bearing the telltale marks of careful preparation and preservation. The cuts were too uniform to be game, too large to be livestock, and too abundant to have come from any legitimate source of supply. Nearby tables held knives and cleavers that were stained with substances that had dried to a dark rust-colored patina. The most damning evidence lay in a side chamber that served as a preparation area for the Cuthbert feasts. Bones had been carefully cleaned and sorted by size, with the larger specimens bearing tool marks that indicated systematic processing for marrow extraction. Personal effects were stored in labeled boxes, watches, rings, shoes, and clothing that told the stories of dozens of missing men. Billy Kincaid's small boots sat on a shelf next to items that Jones recognized as belonging to workers who had vanished months earlier. Jones made a crucial decision in that moment of discovery. Rather than flee with the knowledge they had gained, he chose to steal a page from the company ledger that lay open on one of the preparation tables. The document contained detailed records of the Cuthbert operation, including inventories of materials acquired and schedules for what the ledger euphemistically called processing and consumption. The evidence was incontrovertible, but possessing it also made Jones and his companions accessories to the discovery of the most horrific crime any of them could imagine. The stolen company ledger page that Elijah Jones clutched in his trembling hands contained revelations that transformed his understanding of the Weeping Seam mine from a place of industrial oppression into something far more sinister. The document was written in Silas Cuthbert's meticulous hand, its columns and entries maintaining the same business-like precision that characterized all of the family's commercial dealings as if the systematic consumption of human beings were merely another aspect of profitable mining operations. The ledger's inventory system used coded language that initially obscured its true meaning, but the pattern became clear as Jones studied the entries by lamplight in his hidden quarters. Workers were classified not by their skills or experience, but by their potential value as what the ledger termed consumable resources. The Shanghaied laborers received a special designation that correlated with higher quality ratings, while local workers were marked with notations that suggested they were considered acceptable but not preferred. Most disturbing of all were the quantity calculations that filled the ledger's margins. The numbers suggested that the Cuthbert operation had been processing human beings for sustenance on a scale that went far beyond the needs of 3 men, no matter how voracious their appetites might be. The weekly consumption figures implied the existence of additional participants in the family's cannibalistic practices, perhaps including the mysterious grandsire whose presence had been hinted at but never confirmed. The ledger also contained detailed schedules that coordinated the acquisition of new workers with what were euphemistically termed harvest cycles. The timing suggested that the Cuthberts planned their recruitment efforts around their culinary needs, bringing in fresh laborers whenever their stores of preserved meat began to run low. The efficiency of the system was as impressive as it was horrifying, demonstrating a level of organization that spoke to years of refinement and practice. Financial records within the ledger revealed the true economics of the Cuthbert operation. The family's profits came not from coal extraction, which barely covered the mine's operating expenses, but from what appeared to be payments received from outside parties for what the ledger termed specialty services. The amounts involved were substantial enough to explain the Cuthberts' luxurious lifestyle and their ability to maintain operations that would otherwise have been economically unsustainable. Jones shared his discoveries with Tom Miller and Patrick O'Brien during a clandestine meeting in the depths of the mine, far from any possibility of company surveillance. The 3 men studied the ledger by lamplight, their horror growing as they began to understand the full scope of the Cuthbert family's activities. The mine was not simply a place where men died in industrial accidents, but a carefully orchestrated system for the farming and consumption of human beings. The decision to take action came naturally from their shared revulsion at what they had discovered. Simple escape was impossible in a company town where the Cuthberts controlled every aspect of life, and any attempt to seek outside help would be dismissed as the ravings of disgruntled workers seeking to damage their employers' reputations. Justice would have to be delivered by their own hands, using the tools and knowledge that their years in the mine had provided. O'Brien's expertise with explosives offered a solution that appealed to all 3 men for its poetic appropriateness. Rather than attempting to murder the Cuthberts directly, they would use the mine itself as their weapon, triggering a controlled collapse that would entomb the family in the very chambers where they had consumed their workers. The explosion would appear to be an industrial accident, providing perfect cover for what was essentially a carefully planned execution. The plan they developed over the following days was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. They would wait for the Cuthberts to descend to their hidden dining hall for one of their regular feasts, then trigger charges placed at strategic points in the mine's support structure. The collapse would be contained to the deeper levels, protecting the miners' quarters while ensuring that their oppressors would be buried alive in their own underground palace. October 5th, 1877 began like any other day in the company town of Blackash, with the mine cage carrying its human cargo down into the earth's bowels, while the Cuthbert family maintained their watchful oversight from the manor on the hill. But Elijah Jones and his conspirators knew that this day would end differently, with justice finally delivered to men who had consumed their fellow human beings with the casual efficiency of industrial machinery. The miners had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully placing charges at critical points in the mine's support structure while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. Patrick O'Brien's expertise with explosives had been crucial, allowing them to calculate exactly how much powder would be needed to collapse the deeper tunnels while leaving the upper levels intact. The plan required precise timing and nerves of steel, but the discovery of Billy Kincaid's fate had hardened their resolve beyond any possibility of retreat. The signal they had been waiting for came at sunset, when Tom Miller spotted Silas, Hiram, and Absalom Cuthbert making their way toward the mine entrance with their familiar cart of supplies. The brothers pushed the vehicle with an eagerness that spoke to their anticipation of the feast to come, while their father walked beside them with the satisfied air of a man whose appetites were about to be indulged. This would be their final descent into the chambers where they had consumed so many of their workers. Jones watched from concealment as the Cuthbert family disappeared into the mine's depths, their oil lamps casting dancing shadows on the tunnel walls as they made their way toward the hidden dining hall. He waited 30 minutes to ensure they had reached their destination and begun their preparations, then signaled to O'Brien that the time for retribution had finally arrived. The fuses were lit simultaneously at 3 different locations, their sparks racing through the darkness toward charges that would bring the mountain down upon the heads of the cannibals. If you've made it this far, then you understand that some stories reveal truths that challenge everything we think we know about human nature. The explosion, when it came, was felt throughout the valley as a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. The mine entrance collapsed in a cascade of timber and stone, sealing the passages that led to the Cuthbert family's secret chambers. The ground above the hidden dining hall subsided into a depression that would remain visible for decades, marking the spot where the cannibals had been buried alive with their final feast spread before them. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the miners emerged from their quarters with expressions of carefully rehearsed shock and confusion. They called for help and organized rescue efforts that they knew would be futile, maintaining the pretense that the explosion had been an unfortunate accident rather than a carefully orchestrated execution. Sheriff Cobb arrived within hours to investigate, but found only evidence that supported the official story of a methane ignition that had claimed the lives of the mine's owners. The silence that followed was profound and complete. No screams echoed from the collapsed tunnels. No calls for help penetrated the tons of rock and timber that now sealed the Cuthbert family in their underground tomb. The miners went about their business with the quiet satisfaction of men who had finally balanced the scales of justice, knowing that their oppressors would spend their final hours contemplating the fate they had inflicted upon so many others. Within days, word of the tragedy had spread throughout the region, bringing investigators and reporters who found only evidence of an industrial accident that had claimed 3 lives. The mine was declared unsafe and permanently closed, its tunnels sealed against any future exploration. The company town of Black Ash began its slow dissolution as workers departed for other opportunities, carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes the exploited become the instruments of their master's destruction. The miners believed they had buried 3 men that October night, but the evidence suggests their understanding of the Cuthbert operation was tragically incomplete. The last will and testament of Silas Cuthbert, sealed until after his death and only discovered during probate proceedings, revealed the existence of a 4th participant in the family's cannibalistic enterprise, one whose nature defied conventional understanding of what constituted human life. The document's most disturbing passage referenced my father, the eternal flame in the deep dark, promising that his sustenance shall be maintained as sworn. The language suggested not merely an elderly relative who required care, but something far more sinister that had been hidden in the deepest recesses of the mine. The quantities of food and supplies ordered by the Cuthberts suddenly made sense when viewed as provisions for a creature whose appetites far exceeded those of ordinary men. Tom Miller's account of the sounds he had heard from the sealed sections of the mine took on new significance in light of this revelation. The rhythmic scraping he had described, the low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through solid rock, and the inhuman quality of the voice that had called his name, all pointed to the presence of something that was not quite human, yet possessed enough intelligence to participate in the family's ghastly feasts. The company store ledger that Elijah Jones had stolen contained inventory figures that now appeared to document the feeding requirements of this hidden entity. The weekly consumption totals were far too large for 3 men, even allowing for the most voracious appetites. But they made perfect sense if they included provisions for a creature whose size and hunger exceeded normal human parameters. The grandsire was not simply an elderly patriarch, but something that had been sustained through decades of human sacrifice. Historical records from the region's early settlement period contained fragmentary references to indigenous legends about creatures that dwelled in the deepest caves, beings that had once bargained with desperate men for knowledge and power in exchange for regular tribute of human flesh. The Cuthbert family's mining operation may have been built not to extract coal, but to provide access to one of these ancient entities that had been sleeping in the mountain's depths. The controlled collapse that the miners had so carefully orchestrated had indeed delivered justice to Silas, Hiram, and Absalom Cuthbert, but it had also accomplished something far more significant. They had sealed away a bloodline that had been feeding an ancient hunger for generations, breaking a cycle of sacrifice that might have continued indefinitely if Billy Kincaid's curiosity had not exposed the truth about the family's operations. The depression that formed above the collapsed dining hall was larger than the miners had expected, suggesting that the chambers beneath had been more extensive than their brief exploration had revealed. Geological surveys conducted years later detected cavities that extended deep into the mountain's core, spaces that might once have housed something far larger and more dangerous than the human cannibals who had served as its intermediaries. The true horror of the Cuthbert operation was not that they had consumed their workers, but that they had been feeding something even more monstrous that lurked in the darkness beneath their feet. The miners had not just buried their masters. They had sealed away a family of human servants and their inhuman god, ending a partnership that had sustained itself on the flesh and blood of the innocent for decades. The collapse of the Weeping Sea mine marked the beginning of the end for the company town of Black Ash, as the economic foundation that had sustained the community crumbled along with the tunnels that had provided its primary source of income. Without the Cuthbert family's leadership and the mine's coal production, the settlement found itself unable to maintain the infrastructure necessary for continued operation, leading to a gradual exodus that would eventually leave the valley empty of human habitation. Sheriff Cobb proved surprisingly efficient in managing the official response to the tragedy, filing reports that emphasized the dangerous nature of coal mining and the unfortunate but predictable consequences of working in unstable geological conditions. His investigation concluded that the Cuthbert family had died heroically while attempting to rescue trapped workers, a narrative that transformed them from cannibalistic predators into martyrs for industrial progress. The company store's closure forced the remaining miners to seek work elsewhere, as the credit system that had bound them to Black Ash could no longer operate without the Cuthbert family's financial backing. Most departed within weeks of the collapse, taking their families and few possessions to other mining operations throughout West Virginia and Pennsylvania. They carried with them the knowledge of what they had discovered and what they had done, but also an understanding that the truth could never be spoken aloud without inviting disbelief or worse. Doc Albright signed death certificates for all 3 members of the Cuthbert family, listing the cause of death as crushing injuries sustained during a mine collapse caused by methane ignition. His medical opinion was accepted without question by the county coroner, who had no reason to suspect that the explosion had been anything other than an industrial accident. The certificates were filed with the state registrar and became part of the official record that would persist long after the truth had been forgotten. The probate proceedings for the Cuthbert estate revealed the family's substantial wealth, but also raised questions about the sources of their income that were never satisfactorily answered. The mine's coal production had been marginal at best, yet the family had accumulated assets that suggested revenue streams extending far beyond their official business operations. These discrepancies were noted but not investigated, as there were no surviving family members to contest the estate's disposition. The Black Ash Clarion published its final edition 3 weeks after the mine collapse, with a front-page obituary that praised the Cuthbert family's contributions to the region's industrial development. The newspaper's editor, who had depended on company advertising for his publication's survival, found himself without sufficient revenue to continue operations and was forced to seek employment elsewhere. The community's last link to the outside world was severed, hastening its descent into abandonment. Sheriff Cobb's final entry in his official ledger, dated October 31st, 1877, consisted of just 7 words that carried more meaning than their brevity might suggest. Quiet, final payment received from the company. Matter concluded. The lawman had performed his duties as the Cuthberts had expected, maintaining the official fiction that protected their legacy while ensuring that the truth would remain buried along with their bodies. The abandoned valley where Black Ash once stood has attracted its share of curious visitors over the decades since the mine's collapse, drawn by stories that have grown in the telling and evolved into local legends that bear only passing resemblance to the historical facts. Amateur historians and paranormal investigators periodically make pilgrimages to the site, seeking evidence of the supernatural phenomena that some claim still manifest in the area around the collapsed mine. The most persistent reports concern sounds that emerge from the ground above the former dining hall, described by visitors as metallic scraping, accompanied by what might be voices engaged in conversation far beneath the Earth's surface. Geologists dismiss these accounts as the natural settling of unstable rock formations, but the consistency of the descriptions across multiple independent witnesses suggests that something more than simple geological processes might be at work. Professional archaeologists who have attempted to survey the site have consistently encountered difficulties that force them to abandon their investigations before completing their work. Equipment malfunctions, unexplained illnesses among team members, and funding disputes have prevented any systematic exploration of the ruins. The few artifacts that have been recovered from the surface structures tell the story of a typical company town but reveal nothing about the darker purposes that the settlement served. Modern photographs of the area show a landscape that has been largely reclaimed by forest growth, with only scattered foundation stones marking the locations where the company buildings once stood. The mine entrance remains sealed beneath tons of rock and debris, though some visitors report detecting air currents that suggest the existence of unsealed passages leading deeper into the mountain's interior. The depression that marks the location of the collapsed dining hall has remained remarkably stable despite more than a century of weather and erosion, as if the ground itself refuses to heal over the site where so much horror once unfolded. Local wildlife appears to avoid the immediate area, creating a zone of unnatural silence that contrasts sharply with the abundant life that flourishes in the surrounding forest. Recent attempts to develop the region for recreational use have been consistently thwarted by problems that seem to center on the former Black Ash site. Proposed hiking trails are rerouted to avoid the area after survey teams report equipment failures and unsettling experiences that make their work impossible to complete. Even modern GPS systems sometimes fail to function properly in the vicinity, displaying location data that places users miles from their actual positions. The few residents of the broader Holotip region who possess knowledge of the area's history speak reluctantly about Black Ash, sharing stories that have been passed down through generations but have lost much of their specific detail in the process of oral transmission. They describe the former company town as a place where bad things happened long ago, warning visitors to respect the site's dark legacy by maintaining their distance from ground that has never fully recovered from its traumatic past. The story of Black Ash and the miners who buried their cannibal masters alive forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice and the circumstances that can transform ordinary men into executioners. Elijah Jones and his fellow conspirators were not bloodthirsty murderers, but desperate workers who discovered that their employers had been literally consuming their colleagues and decided that conventional justice was insufficient to address such monstrous crimes. The evidence that survived the collapse, particularly the company store ledger page that Jones smuggled to safety, provides incontrovertible proof that the Cuthbert family operated a systematic program of human consumption that extended far beyond simple murder into the realm of industrial-scale cannibalism. The business-like precision with which they recorded their activities suggests that they viewed their workers not as human beings, deserving of basic dignity, but as livestock to be harvested when the need arose. The miners' decision to orchestrate a controlled collapse, rather than attempt more direct forms of violence, speaks to their understanding that the legal system of their era would never deliver justice against wealthy industrialists, regardless of the evidence presented against them. They chose to become the instruments of retribution themselves, accepting the moral burden of murder in order to prevent the continuation of crimes that they found literally unbearable to contemplate. The revelation that the Cuthberts had been feeding something inhuman that dwelt in the mountain's depths adds a dimension to the story that transforms it from a simple tale of industrial exploitation into something far more sinister. The miners may have believed they were executing 3 cannibalistic employers, but they actually sealed away a family of human servants, along with the ancient entity that had been the true beneficiary of their sacrificial operations. The perfect retribution that Jones and his conspirators delivered came at a cost that extended beyond the simple taking of life. By choosing to become killers themselves, they accepted a burden of guilt that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives, even as they took satisfaction in knowing that they had prevented the continuation of horrors that might otherwise have claimed countless additional victims. The official silence that surrounded the Black Ash incident demonstrates the power of institutional authority to shape historical narratives according to the needs of those in positions of influence. The truth about the Cuthbert family's activities was suppressed not through conspiracy, but through the simple expedient of accepting explanations that protected established interests and avoided uncomfortable questions about the nature of industrial capitalism. Before you go, if you found this story as chilling as I did researching it, then subscribe so you don't miss the other dark truths that lie buried in forgotten places, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up. The miners who orchestrated the Weeping Seam collapse understood that their actions would never be officially recognized as heroic, but they also knew that heroism sometimes requires men to to accept damnation in order to protect the innocent. Their perfect retribution was also their perfect damnation, a choice that saved lives while condemning their own souls to carry the weight of deliberate murder for whatever time remained to them. In the deep dark beneath the hollow-tip mountains, the feast is over and the debt is paid, but the earth itself remembers what was buried there and continues to whisper its secrets to those who know how to listen. The miners of Black Ash discovered that sometimes justice requires ordinary men to become monsters in order to stop greater monsters, and their story serves as a reminder that the line between heroism and horror is often thinner than we dare to imagine.